Welcome back to This is Thailand. I'm glad you're here. Now, if you've been with us for a while, you know the kind of stories we tell on this channel. Men who came to Thailand chasing something, love or the idea of it, a fresh start, easy money, the fantasy of a life that costs half as much and feels twice as warm. And most of the time, those stories have a shape you can see coming from a distance, even when the man living them couldn't. This one is different. This one isn't about a bar girl or a business partner or a condo that turned out to be owned by someone else entirely. This story doesn't have a villain you can point to and say, there, that's where it went wrong. It's quieter than that. And in some ways, that makes it harder to hear. The man who sent us his story is named Ciaran Malloy. He's 65 years old. He's from County Leitrim in the west of Ireland. He spent the better part of his working life doing things that most people wouldn't last a week at. Underground in the dark, breathing air that wasn't really air. And then he spent 11 more years doing something even harder than that, though it looked from the outside like just being a husband. Ciaran came to Thailand with sensible expectations and a reasonable plan. He wasn't chasing anything reckless. He'd done his sums. He thought he'd understood the place. What happened to him there is the kind of thing that could happen to any of us. And that's exactly why it's worth your time. Here's his story, in his own words. Right. So, I want to be clear about something before I start, because I know how these things can sound. I'm not here telling you I was some kind of innocent abroad who had no idea what he was walking into. I'm 65 years of age. I've worked underground in a coal mine. I've poured concrete in February in Birmingham. I spent 11 years watching my wife disappear in front of me, one function at a time. I am not a man who is easily surprised by life being difficult, but Thailand surprised me. Not in the way I expected to be surprised. In a quieter way, a more expensive way. Let me go back. I grew up in Leitrim, which if you're not Irish means I grew up in a county so rural and so overlooked that even other Irish people raise their eyebrows slightly when you mention it. There's a joke that Leitrim has more lakes than people, which is almost true and not entirely a joke. My father worked the bog. My uncles worked the bog. When the Arigna mine was hiring, that was considered the good option, which tells you something about what the other options were. I started at Arigna when I was 17, coal mining in Roscommon. It sounds like it shouldn't exist, and honestly, by the end, it barely did. The seams were thin, and the place was wet, and the dust got into everything. Your clothes, your hair, your chest. We didn't think about the chest part then. You think about your wages and your weekend, and what you're having for your tea. You don't think about what you're breathing in because there's nothing you can do about it, and thinking about it doesn't help anything. The mine closed in 1990. I was 30, and I had a set of skills that were approximately useless in a country that was shutting all its mines. So I did what a lot of lads did. Construction, Ireland first, then England when the Irish sites dried up, Birmingham, then Manchester, then back to Dublin when the Celtic Tiger was roaring and there was money to be made. Scaffolding, groundwork, general laboring. My knees took it badly. My back was never right after a certain point. But the money was decent and the work was there, and I was not the sort of man who sat around wondering if there was something better. I met Mairead at a Céilí in Carrick-on-Shannon in 1987. She was there with her sister, and she told me later she'd noticed me, because I was the only man in the room who wasn't showing off. I thought that was a compliment. It was, mostly. We married in 1989 and had our daughter Offie in 1991. I'm not going to spend a long time on Mairead because it's not that kind of story, and also because I find I still don't have the right words for it, and I'm not sure I ever will. What I'll say is this. She was diagnosed with Parkinson's in 2008 when she was 47. That's young. That's earlier than they expected, and earlier than the type she had usually presents. The neurologist explained it all very carefully, and I sat there nodding and I understood the words, and I had absolutely no idea what I was agreeing to. What you agree to, it turns out, is 11 years of watching someone you love be slowly rearranged by a disease that doesn't have the decency to be quick about it. The tremors first, then the rigidity, then the balance going, then the falls, then the stage where she couldn't manage the stairs, then the stage where she couldn't manage the bathroom, then the stages after that, which I'll not describe because they're hers, not mine, and she was a private woman who would not thank me for it. I gave up the last of the construction work in 2012 to care for her full-time. AOF was in Dublin by then, working, living her life, and I was not going to ask her to come back. That was not a conversation I was willing to have with my daughter. So it was me and Maria in the house in Carrick, and we managed, and I learned what I needed to learn, and I got her to every appointment, and I lifted her when she needed lifting, and I did not complain because what would have been the point of complaining? When she died in March of 2019, the neighbors came with food. They said I'd been wonderful. They said I'd been so strong. I remember standing in my own kitchen with a casserole dish some woman had pressed into my hands, and I thought, I don't feel strong. I feel like I've been strong for so long that I've forgotten what the alternative is. I feel like a man who's been holding a door shut against the wind for 11 years, and someone just told him he can let go, and now I don't know what to do with my arms. I won't pretend I handled the next 2 years particularly well. I didn't fall apart in any dramatic fashion. There was no drinking, no crisis anyone could point to. I just sort of drifted. I sold the house because I needed to, financially and otherwise. Every room in it was still the room where something had happened to her, and I couldn't make them be anything else. I moved into a flat for a while. I did some part-time work for a building supplies firm, just to have somewhere to be. I watched television in the evenings. I rang a waif on Sundays. The money situation, to be precise about it, I had the Irish state pension, which is not generous, but it's reliable. I had a small pension from the years I'd paid into the UK system when I worked in England, and after selling the house and clearing the last of what needed clearing, I had approximately €95,000 in savings. That's not a fortune, but it's not nothing. I knew exactly what I had. I am a careful man with numbers. What I didn't have was any clear sense of what to do with whatever time I had left. The Thailand thing came from a forum. Online, I mean. There's a forum for retired tradesmen, mostly British and Irish fellas, and a lot of the threads are about joint replacements and which painkillers work, and whether the GP will give you physio on the public system or make you wait 18 months, practical stuff. One afternoon I was reading through a thread about knees. My knees were, and remain, a topic of significant personal interest. And a man from Waterford wrote that he'd been getting physio in Chiang Mai for 800 baht a session. At the time, that was about €18. I was paying €85 a session in Roscommon when I could get an appointment, which I often couldn't. He said the weather meant he could walk every morning. He said the food was cheap and good. He said it was quiet and clean, and the people left him alone. That was the entire pitch. Not a young woman, not a party, not any of the things you might associate with Thailand if you've seen the documentaries or talked to a certain kind of man at a certain kind of pub. Just warm, cheap, easy on the joints. I looked into it for about 3 months before I decided. I read everything I could find. I made a spreadsheet. I calculated my monthly costs at home against what the forum lads said it cost to live in Chiang Mai. The difference was significant enough that it wasn't a fantasy, it was just arithmetic. I booked a one-way flight in December of 2021. I landed in January of 2022, 63 years old, moving carefully on bad knees, carrying one large bag and a set of expectations that I had deliberately kept as modest as I possibly could. I thought modest expectations would protect me. I'm going to tell you where they didn't. I landed in Chiang Mai on the 9th of January 2022. It was just after midday, and the heat came at me the moment I walked out of the terminal building. Not aggressive, not like Bangkok can be, but warm in a way that was immediately physically different from anything I'd felt in months. In Ireland in January, you wear 3 layers, and you're still cold in your bones. Here the air had weight to it, a thickness, and I stood on the pavement outside Arrivals with my bag at my feet, and I thought, right, this is different. I'd arranged a guest house near Nimon for the first 2 weeks while I looked for an apartment. A quiet place, clean enough, run by a Thai family who left you alone, if you wanted to be left alone, which I did. I ate my first meal that evening at a place around the corner. Cow pad, fried rice with egg and a bit of pork. Cost me 60 baht, which is about €1.40. I sat at a plastic table on the pavement, watching the motorbikes go past, and thought about what I'd paid for a bowl of soup in the Carrick-on-Shannon Tesco Cafe the previous November. There was no comparison. I found the apartment within 10 days. Second floor of a small building about 5 minutes walk from the Niman area. Nothing fancy. One bedroom, a decent bathroom, a little balcony I never used much. 11,000 baht a month, about €250. For that I got air conditioning, a washing machine, and a landlord who communicated entirely through a line messaging app and was perfectly agreeable as long as the rent arrived on time, which it always did. I signed a 12-month lease, and that was that. Now, I want to be fair to Chiang Mai here, because when people ask me about it now, I don't want to make it sound like it was miserable from the start. It wasn't. The first few months were genuinely good, or as close to good as I was capable of at the time. The physio was the first thing I sorted, and honestly, it might be the best thing I did the whole time I was there. Her name was Nook. A lot of Thai women go by Nook. It's a nickname, means small. And she worked out of a small clinic about 10 minutes from my apartment. 63 years of age, bad knees, compromised lower back, general wear and tear from decades of work that didn't care what it did to you. She assessed me for about 40 minutes on the first visit, asked more questions than any Irish physio ever had, and then said, with the mild directness I'd come to appreciate, that I had the joints of a man who had not been kind to himself. I told her that was fair. 800 baht a session, twice a week to start, then once a week as things improved. That's about €18. I'd been paying 85 in Roscommon and waiting 6 weeks for an appointment. Here I could book 3 days out. Within 6 weeks, I was walking without the stiffness that had been greeting me every morning for years. Properly walking. Down the street, 20 minutes without needing to stop. I don't know if you can understand what that meant unless you've had years of your body arguing with you every morning. It felt, not to overstate it, like a small return of something I'd written off. I built a routine, which is what I do when I'm trying to hold myself together. Walk in the morning before it got too hot. Breakfast at a little place near the canal. Usually a bowl of joke, which is rice porridge, or sometimes kayo tom. Similar thing, sometimes with an egg cracked into it. Always with a glass of Thai iced tea that was so sweet it should have been illegal. The woman who ran the place was maybe 70 and had no English whatsoever, and we communicated entirely through pointing and nodding, and eventually she just started making my usual when she saw me come in, which happened within about a week. That pleased me more than it probably should have. Afternoons I'd walk the old city sometimes, the moat around it, the old walls, the Watts, the temples tucked between ordinary shop houses, monks in orange walking in the early morning, the smell of incense and frangipani and fried garlic all mixed together. Chiang Mai is not Bangkok. It doesn't assault you. It's quieter, more manageable, more human in scale. I could see why the forum lad from Waterford had chosen it. I made a few acquaintances. There was a retired man from Derby called Martin, who I sometimes had dinner with on Friday evenings. Good enough company, bit of a talker. There was a Canadian couple, retired teachers, who'd been there 6 months when I arrived and left after 3 more. They found the heat too much by April, which I'd understand later. At the cafe near my apartment, a few of the regulars nodded at me in the way people nod when they have accepted your presence without requiring any further information. That was the extent of my social life, and I was comfortable with that. I am not, and have never been, a man who needs a lot of company. Working underground, you learn to be at ease with silence. Caring for Marriott meant years of being present without being able to do much with that presence. You learn to occupy yourself quietly. I had my routine and my walks and my books. I'd loaded my phone with more books than I could read in 2 years, and in the evenings I'd sit on the little balcony with a bottle of Chong beer and watch the street below, and I did not feel the need to fill every hour with something. I rang a wife on Sundays. She'd ask how it was going, and I'd say, grand, it's warm, I'm getting around better. She'd tell me about work, about her friends, about her boyfriend, a civil engineer from Meath who I'd met twice and seemed decent enough. The calls were comfortable, not particularly deep. That was fine. What I noticed, and I'm being honest about this, was a strange disorientation that came from not being needed. For 11 years, I had been, every single day, the person who needed to be there. There was always a medication, an appointment, a lift, a meal, a need that required specifically me to meet it. That shapes your sense of yourself in ways you don't fully understand until it stops. In Chiang Mai, nobody needed me for anything. That was, I'd told myself, the point. Peace, rest, no obligations. But there's a difference between having peace and having nothing that requires you, and I was only beginning to understand that those aren't the same thing. I didn't dwell on it. Dwelling is not a thing I do productively. By the time the cool season began to tip into the hotter months, around late March and into April, I'd been there 3 months and it was working. Living costs came to roughly 35,000 baht a month, including everything. Rent, food, physio, transport, the odd beer. About €800. Compared to what I'd been spending in Ireland, I was saving money. The knees were better. The routine was holding. I told myself, this is working. Then April came properly, and with it the burning season. I hadn't read enough about this. The farmers and the land clearers burn the fields and the forest in the north every spring, and the smoke settles over Chiang Mai like a lid on a pot. The air quality monitor on my phone turned red, then purple. You could smell it before you opened the curtains. I started wearing a mask on my walks, then I stopped walking altogether on the worst days. The cough I'd had for years, the one I'd had so long I'd stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing traffic noise, started to change its quality. Deeper, tighter, sitting in my chest differently. The burning season passed, the air improved, but the cough didn't go back to what it had been. I told myself it was just the smoke. I told myself it would settle. By September, it hadn't settled, and I started thinking, for the first time, that I should probably get it looked at properly. That decision, reasonable, sensible, the responsible thing to do, was where everything else began. The Bangkok Hospital Chiang Mai is a private facility on the superhighway. Not the most imaginative name for a road, but it does what it says. A few of the expats at my regular cafe had mentioned it. Clean, they said. English-speaking staff. Expensive by Thai standards, cheap by Western ones, and the doctors actually talk to you rather than looking past you at the next patient. I went on a Tuesday morning in the second week of September, 2022. I told myself it was almost certainly nothing. A chest infection, maybe. Something the smoke had stirred up that needed a course of antibiotics and a week of rest. I described the cough to the doctor. A Thai man, 50s, spoke better English than I did in a way that made me slightly self-conscious about my Leitrim accent. He listened to my chest. He ordered an X-ray. Then on the basis of the X-ray, he ordered a CT scan. I sat in a waiting area with cool air conditioning and a cup of complimentary water, and I wasn't particularly worried. I've spent time in hospitals. I know how to sit in them. The bill for that first visit, consultation, X-ray, CT scan, everything, came to 18,000 baht, about €480. I paid it on my card without great drama. That felt manageable. That felt like the kind of thing you absorbed as part of living somewhere and not having the NHS behind you. What felt less manageable was what the doctor said when he came back with the scan results. He was careful about it, precise. He said there was scarring in my lungs consistent with long-term dust exposure, which surprised nobody, least of all me, and early indicators of COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. He said it wasn't severe. He said it wasn't an emergency. He said, and I remember these exact words because they became something I turned over in my head for the next 2 years. It is something to monitor. I nodded. I asked the right questions. I've always been able to ask the right questions in a doctor's office. It's the sitting with the answers afterwards that I find harder. He gave me a prescription for an inhaler, referred me to a respiratory specialist for follow-up, and shook my hand. I walked out into the Chiang Mai heat, hailed a red Song Thieu back towards Niman, and sat in the back of it with 4 Thai school children and a woman with 2 bags of mangoes, and I thought about the Erigna mine. I thought about the dust. Years of it. The way it coated everything. The way you blew black into a tissue at the end of a shift and thought nothing of it, because everyone did the same. I thought about the men I'd worked with there who were already gone. Mick Feely, who died at 62 with lungs like wet cardboard. Tommy Buren, who never made it to retirement. I'd always assumed I'd been lucky by comparison. Maybe I had been. Maybe this was just luck arriving slightly late. That evening I opened my laptop and looked up COPD. I should not have done this alone at night. If you're ever in the situation of receiving a diagnosis, do not look it up alone at night. What you'll read is the worst version of every possible trajectory, and your brain will find the darkest interpretation of each one, and by midnight you'll have decided you've 3 years left and should probably ring your daughter. I didn't ring Av. I made a cup of tea and I sat with it, and I told myself to be sensible. What I did the next morning was contact my travel insurer. I had an annual multi-trip policy I'd bought online before I left Dublin. €340 seemed comprehensive, covered medical emergencies, evacuation, the lot. I submitted a query explaining the diagnosis and asking about coverage for the specialist follow-up and ongoing medication. The response came 4 days later. It was polite, it was clear. It explained that the policy contained a standard exclusion for pre-existing conditions, defined as any condition that existed or that the policyholder should reasonably have been aware of prior to the policy start date. That phrase, reasonably have been aware of. I read it several times. I understood exactly what it meant. A man who spent years working underground in a coal mine, who has had a persistent cough for the better part of a decade, who has never had his lungs formally assessed. That man, the insurer was explaining with great bureaucratic serenity, should reasonably have been aware that something might be wrong with his respiratory system. Therefore, any respiratory condition is retroactively pre-existing, therefore not covered. I want to be precise here because I think it matters. I don't think they were wrong, technically. That's the worst part. One probably should have had my lungs properly looked at before I left Ireland. I probably should have disclosed the cough. I didn't because I'd had it so long I'd categorized it as not a medical condition, but just the way I was now. A lot of men my age and my background make the same categorization. We're wrong too, but we do. So I rang around, I got 3 quotes for comprehensive expat health insurance that would cover me going forward. All 3 excluded respiratory conditions. One of them excluded, and I am not inventing this, any condition affecting the respiratory, cardiovascular, or musculoskeletal systems, given my stated history of mining and construction work. That's the lungs, the heart, and the joints. For a 63-year-old former miner and laborer, that's approximately everything that might actually go wrong. I tried the public hospital once, Maharaj Nakorn, Chiang Mai, the big government facility near the old city. I'd read it was technically accessible to foreigners. What I hadn't fully absorbed was what accessible means in practice when you have no Thai language, no Thai spouse, nobody with you who can advocate. I took a number. I waited 4 hours on a hard plastic chair in a corridor that smelled of disinfectant and something underneath the disinfectant that I won't describe. When my number came up, I sat across from a nurse who smiled at me with genuine kindness and spoke no English whatsoever. I had my phone. I tried Google Translate. She tried to help. We both tried our best. And after 20 minutes, I went home knowing nothing more than when I'd arrived. That was the only time I tried the public system. I'm not criticizing it. It wasn't designed for me. It was designed for Thai people who speak Thai and have Thai family members to accompany them and navigate on their behalf. I had none of those things, and that is nobody's fault, but it is a fact. So I made a decision. I would manage this privately, out of pocket, and I would be sensible about the cost. I found a respiratory specialist at a smaller private clinic, cheaper than the Bangkok hospital, still English-speaking, recommended by Martin from Derby, who'd had his own cardiac scare the previous year. 4,500 baht a visit every 6 weeks. The medications, a combination inhaler and a mucolytic tablet the specialist prescribed, running to approximately 3,200 baht a month, about €75. I did the arithmetic. 6 weeks between visits, the medication on top. Annually, that came to roughly 85,000 baht, about €2,300 a year, just for the breathing, not for the knees, not for anything else that might come up, just to manage the thing that was already wrong. I remember sitting at my kitchen table with my notebook. I keep a notebook, always have, old habit from the mine, where you wrote down everything because if something went wrong, You needed to be able to account for it. And I wrote down the number and stared at it. It wasn't catastrophic, it wasn't ruinous, but it was not a number I had put in my original spreadsheet because I had not put any serious healthcare costs in my original spreadsheet, because I had not thought I would need to. That was the gap, right there. That was where the plan had a hole in it that I hadn't seen. And then, because one complication is never enough, the specialist mentioned, carefully, offhandedly, the way doctors mention things they want you to have heard but don't want to have said, that in some cases with this presentation, further intervention might eventually be worth discussing. Nothing imminent. Just something to be aware of. Surgery. He didn't say it directly. He didn't need to. I needed a second opinion, not because I doubted him particularly, but because I am the kind of man who, when someone says there might eventually be a problem with a structure, wants to hear from a second engineer before he decides whether to worry. I booked an appointment at a hospital in Bangkok, took the overnight train down, one night in a hotel near the hospital off Sukhumvit, 2 consultations over 2 days, all the relevant scans transferred and reviewed. The Bangkok specialist was thorough and reassuring. No surgery indicated at this stage. Monitoring and management was the right approach. He concurred entirely with the Chiang Mai diagnosis and the treatment plan. The trip cost me 28,000 baht all in, about €750, for the reassurance that nothing needed to be cut open, which is, I grant you, a reasonable thing to pay for reassurance about. I came back to Chiang Mai on the train, watching the flat central plains give way to the northern hills as we got closer, and I thought about the total. The initial visit, the specialist fees, the medications, the Bangkok trip. We were already past the equivalent of €4,000 spent on my health in under 3 months. I was not, I want to be clear, catastrophizing. I was doing the maths. The maths were starting to look different from the maths I'd done in Littrim on my laptop 14 months earlier. But I didn't know yet how much different. That part was still coming. By January of 2023, I had been in Thailand exactly 1 year. I marked the anniversary the way I mark most things. I didn't particularly. I had my morning walk, my breakfast near the canal, my cup of tea afterwards. The routine was intact. The lungs were being managed. The specialist visits had settled into their rhythm, every 6 weeks, in and out. Same questions, same prescription, slight adjustments here and there. I had become, without quite intending to, a man whose primary social engagement was with his doctor. The costs by that point were accumulating in my notebook in a way I tried not to look at too directly. The specialist visits alone through the end of 2022 and into early 2023 had run to around 40,000 baht. The medications were another 20,000 or so over the same period. Add the Bangkok trip. Add the ongoing physio with Nook, which I'd kept up because my knees would fall apart without it, and I was not prepared to add that problem to my existing collection. My monthly outgoings had climbed from 35,000 baht to closer to 48,000. Not a disaster, but the gap between what I was spending and what I'd planned to spend was widening quietly and consistently, the way a slow leak widens a crack. I was 64 years old and I was spending significant money every month simply to stay functional. That was the situation. The waiting room at the specialist clinic was a small rectangle with pale green walls and chairs upholstered in the particular shade of blue that medical facilities worldwide seem to have agreed upon. There was a television on the wall showing a Thai cooking program with the sound off. There was a water dispenser. There were usually 4 or 5 people waiting at any given time. Thai patients mostly, some older, some not. I was generally the only Farang. It was on my 4th or 5th visit, sometime in late January, that I first noticed the old man and his daughter. He was in his 70s at a guess, thin, the particular thinness that comes from illness rather than constitution, sitting very upright in the way some older Thai men do, with a quiet dignity. He had a persistent cough that I recognized immediately, the way you recognize a sound you've been hearing in your own chest. His daughter was with him, doing what daughters do in Thai medical settings, filling in the forms, speaking to the nurses, keeping track of everything. She was maybe 35 or 38, I thought, well-dressed in the way of someone who works in an office or a hotel, composed. I was having difficulty at the reception desk. My insurer, not that my insurer was actually covering anything, but I'd been required to submit documentation for a gap payment scheme that my specialist had mentioned might reimburse a small portion of costs, had sent a form that required a specific code from the clinic. The receptionist was polite and trying to help, and we had reached the limit of what her English and my complete absence of Thai could manage together. The woman stepped in, not obtrusively. She just said, in clear, easy English, "Can I help?" and then spoke to the receptionist in Thai for about 90 seconds and turned back to me and explained what the code was, where on the form it needed to go, and that the receptionist would make a copy of the relevant clinic document for me to attach. 2 minutes. Done. I thanked her. She smiled in the way Thai people smile when you thank them. A slight Y, a small inclination of the head, nothing excessive. She said it was no problem. Her English was good from working in hotel reception. She said her father was here for the same specialist. She said she hoped my appointment went well. She gave me her line ID before I went in case I needed help with something like that again. I saved it in my phone under Noi, her name as she'd introduced herself, and went in for my appointment thinking I probably wouldn't use it. I used it 3 weeks later. I'd been given a new medication by the specialist and the label on the box was in Thai only. The pharmacist had explained the dosage verbally, but I'd been distracted by the cost and wasn't entirely certain I'd retained the instructions correctly. I was sitting at my kitchen table that evening with the box in my hand and I thought, I could try Google Translate, point the camera at it and hope for the best. Or I could send a photo to the woman whose whole job was communicating clearly. I sent it online. She replied within 10 minutes, explained the dosage, the timing, the note about taking it with food, the part that said do not take with certain other medications, which she also helpfully cross-referenced with what she knew I was already taking, because I'd mentioned the combination inhaler in passing at the clinic. That was it. That was how it started, in the least dramatic way imaginable. Over the following 3 months, she helped me with perhaps half a dozen things. She recommended a better pharmacy closer to my apartment, cheaper than the one I'd been using, same medications. She sent me the address on a map. When I had a question about whether my visa category, I was on a retirement visa, which requires renewal annually and has its own particular bureaucratic demands, affected my ability to access any portion of the public health system, she looked into it for me and came back 2 days later with a clear explanation. It didn't, was the short answer. But she'd taken the time to actually find out. She attended one appointment with me in March as an informal translator. The specialist wanted to discuss adjusting my medication regime, and there were nuances in his explanation that I wasn't fully following through his medical English. She sat to one side, translated when I looked uncertain, asked one clarifying question on my behalf that I wouldn't have known to ask. She was in that room exactly what I had been trying to manage without for the previous 6 months. An advocate, someone who understood the system and could stand between me and it when the language gap opened up. I offered to pay her for her time each occasion. She declined each time, genuinely, not as a performance of reluctance. She would have been embarrassed, I think, to be paid for helping someone navigate a situation her father was in as well. I bought her coffee twice, once near the clinic after an appointment, once at a place near Nimon she'd mentioned she liked. We talked for maybe 40 minutes each time, about her work, her father's health, Chiang Mai, what it was like living there as a foreigner. She was good company, direct without being blunt, curious without being intrusive. I want to be specific about what I did and didn't feel during this period, because I know what the obvious assumption is and I want to be accurate about it. I was not in love with her. I was not nursing some romantic notion about a younger Thai woman and an older Irish man. I was 64 years old and I had spent the better part of a year dealing with my own health while existing in a city where I had, at most, 3 people I could describe as acquaintances. What I felt was something simpler and in some ways more dangerous than romance. I found her useful, and I found her company not unpleasant. And after years of being the person who helped everyone else, there was something in being helped, clearly, competently, without fuss, that I hadn't fully registered I was missing. Looking back now, I think the word useful was doing rather a lot of heavy lifting in how I categorized what was happening. Useful is a practical word. It doesn't carry any weight of obligation or expectation. It lets you take the help without examining too carefully what accepting it might eventually require of you. I told myself I was being clear-eyed about the situation. Sensible. I knew the stories. Every expat in Chiang Mai who'd been there more than 6 months knew the stories. Bar girls, business partners, the various arrangements that Western men of a certain age in a certain loneliness walked into with their eyes half closed. This was different. This was a hospital waiting room and a pharmacy question and 2 cups of coffee. I told myself that. I was, it turns out, half right. The situation was different. The destination wasn't. I'm going to tell you what happened over the next 14 months the way I experienced it, which is to say, one reasonable thing at a time. That's the part that's hardest to explain to people who haven't been in it. There was no single moment where I sat across from someone who said, "Give me your money," and I handed it over like a fool. It was a series of individually defensible decisions that added up, collectively, to something I can't entirely defend. I know how that sounds. It's still the truth. The first request came in May of 2023. We'd been in contact for about 4 months by then. Noi messaged me on a Tuesday evening. Apologetically, she said sorry twice before she even got to the point. To say that her father's medication that month had been more expensive than usual, the hospital had added a new drug to his prescription, and they had asked for a deposit before dispensing it that she didn't have until her salary came in at the end of the month. Could she borrow 15,000 baht? She would pay it back in 3 weeks. I thought about it for approximately 1 hour. Then I transferred 20,000 baht and told her to keep the difference, that medication costs were unpredictable, and having a small buffer was sensible. It was 12,000 baht back. She sent it without being asked at the end of July, 2 months later rather than 3 weeks. She apologized for the delay. I told her it didn't matter. And the thing is, it didn't matter. 12,000 baht is about 300 euro. I had not been sitting waiting for it. I noticed the return of it primarily because it recalibrated something in my head. This was a person who paid back what she borrowed. That recalibration turned out to be expensive. The second request came in August. The motorbike. She'd had it for years, she said. It had broken down catastrophically. The word she used was catastrophically. And I remember noticing the precision of the word for someone whose first language wasn't English. And the repair cost was more than the bike was worth. She needed to replace it to get to work. The hotel she worked at was on the far side of the city from where she lived. No useful Songthaew route. Motorbike was the only option. 25,000 baht, about 650 euro. This one she did not frame as a loan. She didn't offer to pay it back and I didn't ask. I told myself, she paid back the last one without being reminded. I'm helping a friend replace a vehicle she needs for work. This is not a complicated moral situation. Looking back, I noticed I had stopped applying the same analysis I'd applied to the first request. The first one I'd thought about for an hour, the second one I thought about for maybe 20 minutes. I was already inside a pattern I hadn't named. October brought the rent situation. Her landlord had decided with 3 weeks' notice to raise her rent substantially. She was in a decent area of town near her work, and property prices had moved. She'd tried to negotiate, he wouldn't budge, and she needed 3 months deposit plus first month to secure a new place before giving notice on the old one. 36,000 baht, about 950 euro. I mentioned this one to Martin from Derby over dinner one Friday. Not because I wanted his opinion, exactly. More thinking aloud. He listened and then said, in that careful Derby way of his, that it was none of his business. But the but hung there for a moment. He said he'd heard similar stories, not accusing anyone of anything. Just, he'd heard similar stories was all. I said, I know where she works. I've met her at the hospital with her father 4 or 5 times. This isn't that. He nodded and let it go, and we talked about something else, and I went home and transferred the 36,000 baht. I want to be honest about something. There was a moment, just before I transferred that one, when I had a thought I didn't let myself finish. It started with, but what if, and then I closed it down. I closed it down because I had built a specific story about who Noi was and what the situation was. And interrogating that story too carefully felt at the time like a kind of betrayal of someone who had been genuinely helpful to me. That's not a logical position, but it was mine. The final request came in February of 2024. She sent me a longer message than usual, on a weeknight, around 9 in the evening. Her father's condition had deteriorated. His doctor had recommended a procedure. She described it in general terms, an intervention to improve airflow. She didn't know the technical name in English. The public hospital had him on a waiting list. 18 months, she said. He didn't have 18 months, she believed. There was a private hospital in Chiang Mai that could do it within 6 weeks, but they required the full estimated cost up front before putting him on the schedule. 60,000 baht. I read it several times. I put down my phone and I sat with my Chang beer on the balcony and I looked at the street below and I thought for longer than I had thought about any of the others. 60,000 baht is about 1,600 euro. In the context of my savings, it was not ruinous. That was the honest first thought, and I'm not proud of the order in which I thought things. But the second thought, the one that sat with me longer, was this. I know what it is to sit with someone who needs a procedure and be told to wait. I spent 11 years watching Mariad wait for appointments, wait for assessments, wait for the next stage of something that only went in one direction. If someone had offered me 60,000 baht to move her up a queue, I would not have hesitated. I asked to see the hospital quote. She sent a screenshot from her phone, a document in Thai with a hospital logo at the top, a series of line items I couldn't read, and a total figure at the bottom that matched what she'd asked for. The logo looked legitimate. The format looked like a hospital document. I couldn't read a single word of it. I transferred the money the following morning. The running total by the time I add up all four amounts, 20,000, 25,000, 36,000, 60,000 baht. That's 141,000 baht in direct transfers. She kept sending smaller messages through those months. A thank you, an update on her father's progress, a photo of him looking better after the procedure which she sent in March, and which I looked at for a long time. I took it at face value. I had no way to do anything else. In parallel with all of this, my own healthcare costs continued their steady accumulation. The specialist every 6 weeks, the medications every month. An additional pulmonary function test my specialist recommended in late 2023, another 6,000 baht. My savings, which I checked at the end of every quarter with the discipline of a man who keeps records, had fallen from 95,000 euro to somewhere around 73,000 by June of 2024. In 18 months, I had spent the equivalent of 22,000 euro. Some of it on my own health, which I had no choice about. Some of it on Noi's father, which I had a choice about and made the wrong one. Not the whole wrong one. Part of the wrong one. That distinction matters to me, though I understand if it doesn't matter to anyone else. What I didn't yet know was that the next few months would cost me something that couldn't be recorded in a notebook. The retirement visa in Thailand, the non-immigrant OA, if you want the official name, requires annual renewal. You have to prove you're not working, prove you have sufficient funds, and prove you're over 50, which at 64 I managed without difficulty. The funds requirement is where it gets complicated. The standard route is to show 800,000 baht sitting in a Thai bank account, about 22,000 euro, which you have to have deposited and seasoned for a specific period before the renewal date. I didn't have 800,000 baht in a Thai bank account because I am not the sort of man who parks 22,000 euro in a foreign bank earning minimal interest when I'm trying to manage a healthcare budget. The alternative route is income proof, showing that you receive at least 65,000 baht per month from a pension or other income source. My combined Irish and UK pensions, converted to baht, came in just under that figure most months, depending on the exchange rate. I'd been managing on this method, with documentation from the Irish Department of Social Protection and a letter from my UK pension provider, for 2 renewal cycles. It was never entirely comfortable. Immigration officers interpreted their requirements with a certain individual discretion that I had learned to navigate by arriving early, dressing respectably, and bringing more documentation than they asked for. The July 2024 renewal was different from the start. The officer who reviewed my file flagged that one of my pension letters was not on official headed paper in the format they required. The Irish pension documentation had changed its layout the previous year. It was still official, still stamped, still accurate, but it didn't match the template the officer had seen before. And in Thai immigration bureaucracy, a document that doesn't match the expected template is a document that doesn't exist. I needed the letter translated into Thai by a certified translator and resubmitted with a specific endorsement. This was not a simple task. I didn't know a certified translator. I knew one person in Chiang Mai who had any facility with the kind of official Thai English bureaucratic language that immigration required. I messaged Noi on a Thursday morning. She replied that afternoon. She was very busy at work that week. A large group had checked into the hotel. Management was stretched. Could it wait until next week? It could not wait until next week. My current visa had 11 days left on it. I messaged again the next day. She replied that she was sorry. There was a family issue. She would try to help, but couldn't be sure when she'd be free. On the third day I stopped waiting. I went alone. The Chiang Mai immigration office is on the Promenade Road, out past the airport. It's a large modern building that is always, regardless of what day or time you arrive, extremely full of people waiting. I took a number. I sat on a plastic chair in the main hall with my folder of documents for 4 hours and 15 minutes, during which time I watched a slow procession of other foreigners, mostly older men, mostly European, mostly with the slightly worn look of people who have been doing this long enough to know it is always like this, navigate the same process with varying degrees of success. When my number came up, I sat across from a young officer who spoke functional English and reviewed my documents with the careful attention of someone who has been specifically trained to find problems. She found the pension letter. She agreed it was official. She agreed it was stamped. She said it needed to be in the required format. I asked what the required format was. She showed me a printed example. I pointed out that my letter contained all the same information in a different arrangement. She was polite and immovable. She gave me a slip explaining what I needed to resubmit and told me I could come back when I had it. I came back the next day, having spent the intervening afternoon finding a translation service near the Niman area that could produce the required document for 1,500 baht in 24 hours. The second visit took only 2 hours. The visa was renewed. I left the immigration building in the heat of the early afternoon and stood in the car park and felt, for the first time in 2.5 years in Thailand, genuinely and specifically angry. Not at the immigration officer who had been doing her job. Not at Thailand, which has its bureaucratic requirements like any country. At myself. At the shape of the afternoon, which had shown me in bright practical light exactly how dependent I had allowed myself to become on one person, and exactly what happened when that person was unavailable. I went to my regular cafe that evening. It was around 6 o'clock, the heat just starting to ease. The smell of mooping, grilled pork skewers, drifting from the cart on the corner of the street. I sat with a Leo beer and my own thoughts for a while. A man I knew slightly, a Scottish man named Alistair, who'd been in Chiang Mai for 5 years and ran some kind of online business I'd never fully understood, was at his usual table. We'd exchanged pleasantries before, no more than that, but that evening I found myself describing the situation, not naming Noi, framing it as a general question about the expat experience, asking whether he'd seen this kind of arrangement before, a person who helps you navigate things, a person who needs help back occasionally, the gradual accumulation of assistance in both directions. He listened without interrupting. He put down his beer. He said carefully and without any judgment in his voice that I could detect, That's a pattern that exists here." He explained it the way you'd explain something to someone who needed to understand it, but didn't need to feel bad about not having understood it sooner. Some women, he said, particularly women with genuine family difficulties, sick parents, financial instability, the kind of pressures that are entirely real and entirely common in Thailand, identified older foreign men who needed practical help that money alone couldn't buy. Language, navigation, advocacy. They provided that help genuinely. The help was real. The need on both sides was real. But it was also, if you looked at it plainly, a resource relationship. The foreign man had money and needed the system explained. The woman needed money and could explain the system. Both things were true at the same time. The sick parent, he said, is usually not invented. That's what makes it hard. The need is genuine. The calculation is also genuine. I sat with that for a bit. The street was filling up with the early evening crowd, motorbikes and tuk-tuks, the sound of a temple bell from somewhere nearby, the ordinary noise of a city going about its evening. I had been part of a system, not a con in the crude sense. Something more human than that, and in some ways harder to dismiss because of it. I went home and didn't message Noi. I simply didn't send the message I might have sent. She messaged me 10 days later. A cheerful line message with a sticker of a cartoon cat and the words, "Hope you are well. How are you feeling these days?" I replied, "Fine, thank you. Busy at the moment." She sent a thumbs up emoji. After that, nothing. She didn't follow up. She didn't ask again. She moved on, which told me everything Alistair's explanation had left slightly ambiguous. That confirmation, the absence of pursuit, the clean departure, landed differently from how I'd expected. I hadn't expected drama. I'm not a dramatic man, but I think I'd expected to feel something sharper. Instead, I felt the particular flat weight of a man who has confirmed something he'd already half known and simply hadn't finished the thought. I opened my notebook that evening and did the accounting I hadn't done properly before. My own healthcare costs, forward projected over the next 2 years, assuming no deterioration. The medications, the specialist visits, the probability of additional tests, the insurance I still couldn't get for the condition I actually had, the savings trajectory if things continued as they were. I wrote the numbers down in a column, the way I used to write down survey figures underground, because if you don't record the exact shape of the problem, you can't work out where the structure is failing. The numbers, when I wrote them all down in sequence, did not support staying. The decision to leave didn't come as a moment, it came as a morning. November 2024. Cool season again. The nicest time in Chiang Mai. The air clear, the temperature down to something a European body can manage without complaint. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open and a cup of tea going cold beside me, and I put the numbers into a proper spreadsheet for the first time. Not the notebook, where I'd been recording individual costs. A proper projection. What I had. What I was spending per month on healthcare alone. What that spending would look like in 2 years and 5 years, assuming the COPD remained stable, which the specialist was cautiously optimistic about but could not guarantee. What would happen if it didn't remain stable? The savings figure at that point, approximately €58,000. Down from €95,000 when I'd left Ireland. €22,000 spent on healthcare over nearly 3 years. The specialist visits, the medications, the Bangkok trip, the follow-up tests, everything the lung required. €9,000 more or less to Noi. The rest to 3 years of ordinary living costs in a city I'd chosen because it was affordable. The healthcare projection was the problem. Without insurance covering respiratory conditions, which I still could not get, had not been able to get since the diagnosis, and was unlikely to be able to get at 65 with a documented COPD history, I was self-insuring against an open-ended liability. If the condition progressed, costs would not increase gradually. They would step change. A hospitalization in a Thai private facility, even a short one, could run to several $100,000 baht. My €58,000 at current healthcare spending rates would last perhaps 7 years if nothing went wrong. If something went wrong, considerably less. There was also something simpler, and I may as well say it plainly. I had no one in Thailand who had to care what happened to me. Not legally, not practically, not in any way that would matter if things became serious. The expat community is kind in its way. Alistair would probably have helped in a crisis. Martin from Derby might have. The woman who ran my breakfast place would have noticed if I stopped coming in. But none of that is the same as having a system that has an obligation to you. I had 40 years of PRSI contributions sitting in Dublin, paying for a health service I hadn't used in 3 years, a service that would treat my lungs as a matter of entitlement rather than ability to pay. The irony of that, paying into a system for 40 years, then leaving it behind to pay out of pocket in a country that owed me nothing, had been background noise for a long time. Sitting at that kitchen table in November, with the spreadsheet in front of me, it became foreground noise. Quite loud, actually. I booked a flight home in the second week of November. One-way Dublin, mid-January. I gave my landlord the required notice. I messaged Nook the physio to explain I was leaving and to book a final few sessions before I went. The leaving was, in most respects, quiet. I gave away the things I didn't want to carry, some kitchen items, a small fan, a few books I'd already read. I had one last dinner with Martin from Derby, who was staying on. He said he was sorry to see me go, and I believed him, which is about as much as you can ask of someone you've eaten dinner with every few weeks for 3 years without ever quite becoming close friends. Alistair I saw at the cafe once more. He asked how I was getting on, and I told him I was going home, and he nodded as if this was the sensible conclusion to a situation he'd already understood better than I had at the time. The last appointment with Nook was harder than I'd expected. She'd had her hands on my knees and back every week for the better part of 3 years, and she knew my body's specific failures the way only a physio or a doctor does. Not abstractly, but practically, the exact angles and limitations. She told me to keep doing the exercises she'd taught me, not to stop walking just because the cold would be discouraging, and to find a good physio in Ireland before the joints stiffened up again. She said, and I'll remember this, she hoped my lungs would be well managed at home. It was a simple thing to say. It was the right thing. I thanked her and meant it more than I managed to express. My last meal in Chiang Mai was at the breakfast place near the canal. The woman who'd been making my usual order for 3 years didn't know I was leaving. I didn't tell her. I ate my cow tom and drank my Thai iced tea and watched the street outside and thought, this is a good place. It was a good place for me, for a while. It ran out of road, that's all. I landed in Dublin in the middle of January in the dark, in the rain, and collected my bag and took the bus to the city, and then the train west, and arrived in Sligo, which is where Oife had helped me find a flat before I left. On a gray Tuesday morning that smelled exactly like every Tuesday morning in the west of Ireland has smelled my entire life. Damp stone and sea air and something faintly peaty underneath. The flat is smaller than the house in Carrick. I don't miss the house. It was the right house for a different version of my life, and I've stopped feeling that as a loss. I had my first appointment at Sligo University Hospital's respiratory clinic 6 weeks after I got home. The consultant, a woman, 50s, no-nonsense Sligo accent, reviewed my Thai specialist's notes, looked at my current readings, adjusted one of my medications, and told me to come back in 4 months. The consultation cost me nothing. The medication is covered under my medical card. 40 years of PRSI contributions, finally doing the job they were paid to do. I've thought a lot about what I'd say to a man sitting where I was sitting in 2021, with a modest amount of savings and a plan that looked reasonable on paper. Here's what I'd tell him. The maths you do before you go to a place like Thailand, the rent, the food, the physio, the transport, that maths is real, but it's incomplete. What it leaves out is the cost of aging, not the visible cost of aging, which you can estimate, the structural cost, the rights you no longer have, the system that doesn't owe you anything, the insurance that won't cover you for what's actually wrong with you, the advocate who isn't there when the paperwork needs doing and your visa has 11 days left, the loneliness that isn't dramatic enough to call loneliness, but that shows up in the form of giving €9,000 to a woman you found useful because being needed, even financially, felt like something. I don't regret going. I want to be precise about that. The physio alone probably bought me 5 years of walking without pain that I wouldn't otherwise have had. The cool season mornings in Chiang Mai were genuinely good for me in a way that's difficult to quantify, but that I believe was real. I went for sensible reasons and I stayed for sensible reasons, and I came home for sensible reasons. I am a sensible man who made a sensible plan that had a hole in it he didn't see. The hole was, I forgot to count what getting old actually costs. Not the bills you can predict, the ones that come from having a body that's been used hard in a country that will treat you well for as long as you can pay and no further. Do the maths properly, not just the rent and the food, the whole maths. That's all I have, And that's where we'll leave Siren Malloy, 65 years old, back on familiar ground, breathing cleaner air than he expected, and carrying the kind of hard-won clarity that only comes from learning something the expensive way. Here at This is Thailand, we tell these stories because they're true and because the men who live them are generous enough to share them so others don't have to. Siran's story isn't about Thailand failing him. Thailand did what Thailand does. It was warm and affordable and welcoming for as long as the conditions were right. What it couldn't be was a country that owed him anything. And that gap between what a place offers and what it owes you is the gap that catches people. If you're planning a retirement abroad, anywhere, not just Thailand, we'd ask you to think hard about the healthcare question before you go. Not just the cost of treatment, which is often genuinely lower than at home. The question of what happens when you can't get insurance, when the public system isn't designed for you, when the one person who knows how to navigate it on your behalf isn't available. That question doesn't come up in the YouTube videos about cheap living costs and beautiful temples. It comes up in November at a kitchen table with a spreadsheet. If this story was useful to you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. Subscribe if you want to keep hearing from the people who came here, learn the hard lessons, and were willing to talk about them honestly. Take care of yourselves out there. This is Thailand.